we all love, we all smile, we all cry. And if we can get past sort of these labels of, you know, I'm white this and I'm black this, we can begin to become more diverse people as opposed to just focusing on trying to find diverse books.
I think we don't give kids enough credit. I think that we think they don't have the understanding that they genuinely have. I was in Tampa for St. Louis Armstrong Beach at a school that was primarily non-black, and there were 5 groups of students, 5 classes, and they'd all read this book. And their questions, none of their questions had anything to do with the race of the main character. Their questions were about the romance. Their questions were about the dog. Their questions were about how it was just amazing that he saved the old lady in the attic. They were with him on that adventure. To them, it was an adventure story. It was not about an African-American clarinet playing sassy kid. It had nothing to do with his race. It only had to do with the adventure. And we need to give kids credit for seeing humanity and not seeing race.
Can I add one more thing? It's actually more about bookstores. When my second picture book came out, I went to my local independent bookstore. I was so excited, and I was looking for it in the picture book section, which was very big, and I couldn't find it. And then I noticed that it was in this little section that was called multicultural picture books. And it made me realize that my book wasn't going to be easily discoverable because it had been labeled and categorized and compartmentalized. And that, I didn't know why it just couldn't be right out there with all the books, so any kid going by would say, look at this is for me. I think it's moving in a way so that the ways that we present diverse books aren't also saying, this is not for me, when kids look at them.
Kat, I would add this. I would say that, first and foremost, I consider myself to be, to have been raised to be extremely proud of who I am. So I am a 6'4" black man. I am so black. I am ebony, trapped, dark, black, and lovely, brown, mocha, jumping, double black brown. Night black, out of sight black. But here's the problem I see. You talk about being compartmentalized and labeled. Bookstores and bookstore managers and publishers and editors are a reflection of our society. They are not separate. They are a part of. And so my 5-year-old, I dropped her off for a play date at her friend Camille's house. And Camille is a white girl, 5 years old, and they've been best friends for a year and a half in Montessori. And I go into the house and I'm in her room and I look in her bookshelf, and out of about 60 books, how many books do you think had books of color? One. The one that I gave her for her birthday. And so then the question then becomes, if the children don't see color and don't see race, what happens from that age until they become the bookstore manager? Well, number one, they don't have books on the shelf because the parents aren't buying them books that reflect the kind of world that we claim we want to see. So really the problem, or not the problem, but the solution begins with what are we going to do as parents? Are we going to have books on our shelves that are going to reflect the kind of society that we claim we want?
I think the question of the bookstore having 2 different sections actually arose from a sort of misguided idea that you're going to be doing your customers a favor by putting all these books up. Anybody who came in looking for a multicultural book would want them all in the same place. course, that opens up the door to, does anybody ever walk into a bookstore and say, where's your white section? Where's your straight section? You're already standing. But it's great that you're talking about giving kids enough credit to do this. Actually, one of my kids wanted to ask you all this question. Do you try to write books about race and about people of color? Or do you try to just write? Or do you have different times where you do both? Or do either or?
Well, I feel that art is very autobiographical. And when you start to create works, for me, when I was creating the drawings for Low Riders in Space, the setting immediately became the border town that I grew up in. And so the drawings are filled with some of the signage from the streets of Juarez and El Paso, as well as just the way the characters handle themselves, how they walk, their hair, were all taken from things that I remember seeing as a young boy. And so while I wasn't necessarily thinking about race as I drew the book, I was definitely thinking about everything that surrounded me as a young boy. And I feel that when someone looks at the book, they're going to be introduced to my desert town, and the people that I hung out with, and it's pretty great, And I think that just I think all of the authors here bring their own experiences and their own way of life into what they're writing, or drawing.
I don't think I write about race necessarily. Most of my characters are Black, and I don't think that the stories are necessarily about race, so it's not something I really think about. Like Raul was saying, trying to roll my R's. You write what you know, and also as a Black writer, I feel like there are not a lot of books that reflect, the kids that I grew up with, and Black kids, and kids of color, and kids from the Bronx, and so I feel like that's something that I could bring to it, because that's what I wanted to read when I was growing up, and it just wasn't there.
I think sometimes it's an issue of writing about history versus writing about race, so that if I'm writing historical fiction, my focus is going to be on things that have impacted African Americans. So it's going to be about race, whether it's civil rights or slavery. If someone were to come into a bookstore and say, I want a book about a Black girl growing up in the 1950s, I'm not sure that in the South, I'm not sure that a book could be written about a Black girl growing up in the 1950s in the South without addressing the issue of race. So rather than being racially driven, I think it's historically driven. And I think that's the distinction that has to be made. It's not necessarily racially driven, but it's historically based.
The question is actually very interesting for me, because I think this is the only book here that I wrote outside of my race. My protagonist is white. And I actually didn't know that was going to happen, because my book started with the food. I had thrown a bridal shower for my sister when she got married, and she said, let's make the food all kind of 60s, 70s hostess vibe, and it was a little Jell-O molds and things like that. And I did. And afterwards she said, there's got to be a screenplay that we can write, and we can do a movie about food like this. And I said, absolutely. And years went by, and I realized I wanted to actually write a children's book, and I knew the kind of food I wanted, but I didn't really know the story yet. And I was actually in one of those kind of, when you get that writer zone, and you're just completely in that euphoric flow. I was writing, and I was writing this recipe out, and a voice came out, and when I stepped out of my glow, I looked and I was like, wow, I wrote as a young Southern white girl who grew up in a trailer park, and I wasn't really expecting that. And, I actually, as to your question, you're never supposed to write as if someone is looking over your shoulder. Well, I hadn't been, but when I came out of it, suddenly I felt that pressure should I be doing this? I know people are going to say, well, why didn't you write an Asian character? They're going to question why I was doing what I was doing. And I did try, and I don't think my editor even knows this. I went back and I said, you know, my mom was a 60s, 70s hostess, and she used to throw parties with like jello molds, and maybe I can do some kind of Asian version of this. And I actually really gave it an effort, and for some reason, that voice, that particular story wasn't coming together. And this one was, so it's an interesting thing. I actually did try to write race, but what actually ended up was, I think that the most important thing is to write whatever is true and is coming out and puts you in that euphoric rosy writer's book, you know, where it comes naturally.
I think historical fiction aside, historical picture books, as we know Jackie Whitson does so eloquently. I think the question itself, you know, do you write about race or are you writing race? I started off writing love poems. I mentioned that I'm a 6'4" black man. I have never been a slave, yet I know I am whipped. I have never been to Canada, yet I have crossed your border. I have never traveled underground, yet the night knows my journey. If I were a poet in love, I'd say that with you, I have found that new place where romance is just the beginning and freedom is our end. So my question is, does it matter? Is that love poem a love poem? Is it a love poem by a 6'4" black man? Is it a race love poem? I think at some point the responsibility has to be on the readers also, not just on the writers in terms of writing race, but on the readers. Are you seeing race? Are you labeling it? Are you compartmentalizing it? As James Baldwin says, it's you know, our stories, in particular African American stories, are universal.